In 1944, in the deeply segregated town of Alcolu, South Carolina, two young white girls were found brutally murdered. Within hours, a 14-year-old black boy named George Stinney Jr. was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death, all in a matter of days. With no lawyer present during his interrogation, no defense at trial, and no time for appeal, George was electrocuted just 83 days after his arrest. He was so small he had to sit on a Bible to fit the electric chair. Nearly 70 years later, a court would uncover the truth. There was no evidence, no justice, and George was innocent. This is the chilling true story of America's youngest execution in the 20th century, a case that still haunts the conscience of a nation. To understand the full scope of this true crime story, let's go back to where it all began. In the spring of 1944, the small mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina, was a quiet, close-knit community built around the operations of the local lumber and cotton mill. Life there was simple and structured, with most families tied in some way to the mill, either through work, housing, or community services. The town itself was divided into separate sections based largely on employment and housing arrangements, with families living in areas assigned by their association with the company and their roles in the mill. On one side of the railroad tracks stood the company's main offices, churches, and housing provided for its skilled workers. On the other, more modest homes were occupied by families working in the labor and support roles. Among those families was the Stinney family. George Stinney Jr., born on October 21, 1929, was the second youngest of 5 children. His father, George Stinney Sr., worked steadily at the local sawmill, while his mother, Ann Brown Stinney, cared for the children and managed their household. The Stinneys were known for their strong family values and involvement in church and community life. George Jr. was remembered as a bright, thoughtful, and well-mannered young boy who liked to ride his bicycle, tend to the family garden, and attend school with his older siblings. His teachers described him as attentive and capable, and those who knew him recalled that he was gentle, respectful, and helpful around the house. Alcolu may have been small, but it had a strong sense of order and routine. Life moved at a steady rhythm, shaped by the mill's schedule, church gatherings, and school activities. Yet beneath that rhythm, change and challenge could come suddenly, and for George Stinney Jr., the quiet streets of his hometown would soon become the setting for a case that would be remembered for decades. What began as a typical day in a peaceful southern town would soon unravel into a chain of events that would forever change the lives of one family and capture the attention of an entire nation. It was Thursday, March 23, 1944, a warm spring afternoon in Alcolu, South Carolina. School had let out, the lumber mill was winding down for the day, and the streets of the small mill town buzzed with the quiet rhythms of daily life. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, 2 young girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames, set out on their bicycles as they often did, to explore the edges of town and enjoy the early spring weather. The girls were close friends and known for riding together through the neighborhoods, often stopping to chat with local residents along the way. That day they had reportedly been searching for a particular type of wildflower, perhaps for a school project or simply to pass the time. Witnesses later recalled seeing them pedaling together along the dirt roads that curved through both residential areas and open farmland. One of their stops brought them near the home of George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old boy who was outside in his yard with his 7-year-old sister, Amy, tending to their family's cow. The girls approached and briefly spoke with George and Amy, asking if they knew where to find maypops, a common term for passion flowers that grew wild in the area. After a brief exchange, the girls continued on their way. That short conversation would be the last known interaction the girls had with anyone before they disappeared. As evening began to fall and the girls had not returned home, their families became increasingly concerned. Betty June's father, a local mill worker, and Mary Emma's family contacted neighbors and began searching the familiar paths, fields, and wooded patches that surrounded the town. The concern quickly spread, and by nightfall members of the community had joined the search, using lanterns and flashlights to comb the area in hopes that the girls had simply gotten lost or had a minor accident with their bicycles. But the hours passed with no sign of either child. At approximately 8 a.m. the next morning, on March 24th, searchers discovered a horrifying scene. Near a remote, tree-lined area by a narrow dirt road, less than 300 yards from the Stinneys' home and close to the town's railroad tracks, the bodies of both girls were found lying in a shallow, muddy ditch. Betty June and Mary Emma had both suffered severe, fatal head injuries. Their skulls had been crushed by repeated blows with a blunt object, believed to be a piece of scrap metal, possibly a railroad spike or a large iron bar, which was found nearby. The girls' bicycles were discovered later, leaning against a tree not far from the ditch, untouched and upright. Initial accounts from investigators suggested that Mary Emma had been hit at least once, and Betty June, being older and possibly trying to protect her younger friend, had been struck more violently, sustaining multiple fractures to her skull. There were also early speculations of possible sexual assault. However, later reviews of the autopsy records offered no conclusive evidence of this. Forensic science in 1944 was limited, and no biological evidence such as fingerprints, blood analysis, or hair samples were preserved or tested. There was no documentation of a properly secured crime scene, no chain of evidence, and no detailed investigation notes that survive to this day. The discovery of the girl's body sent a shockwave through the town of Alcolu. In a place where families knew each other well and children played freely in the streets, the idea that such a brutal crime could happen in their own backyard was terrifying. Fear quickly gave way to urgency. Within hours, the community demanded answers, and law enforcement was under immediate pressure to identify and arrest the suspect. Instead of casting a wide net, examining the crime scene thoroughly, or interviewing a broad range of potential witnesses, the focus of the investigation narrowed almost immediately. George Stinney Jr., the quiet 14-year-old boy who had briefly spoken with the girls the day before, was identified as the last person known to have seen them alive. That single fact, one innocent interaction, was enough for authorities to act on. On the night of March 24, 1944, just hours after the bodies of 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames were discovered in a muddy drainage ditch near the railroad tracks in Alcolu, George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old boy, was arrested at his family's home by local authorities. He was taken by Clarendon County deputies without a warrant, without explanation to his parents, and without being advised of his rights. There was no formal charge presented at the time of arrest, and no opportunity given to the family to secure legal counsel. His mother and father, confused and terrified, were left behind as George was transported nearly 30 miles away to the Sumter County Jail, a place unfamiliar and isolated from anyone he knew. Inside the jail, George was separated from his family and community entirely. He was placed in a small cell, reportedly among adult detainees, and was denied the presence of an attorney, a parent, or even a local pastor. 4 hours, possibly overnight, he was questioned by law enforcement officers, including Deputy H.S. Newman, who would later testify to the alleged confession George gave. But no third party was present in the room. There was no stenographer, no tape recorder, no transcript. Not even a signed document to confirm that George had made any voluntary statement at all. According to the official account, George had admitted to attacking the girls with a heavy metal object, supposedly confessing that he had followed them into a secluded area after their brief conversation about wildflowers, and that the crime escalated when Mary Emma was knocked unconscious. The details of this so-called confession, however, have shifted over time depending on which official account you read, and none of them have ever been independently verified. There is no evidence that George understood what he was being asked. No record exists of the specific questions posed to him. And crucially, there is no documented confession in his own handwriting or even with his signature. Despite this, George's alleged statement would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, offered to the public as a full admission of guilt, even though it had no legal paper trail. Meanwhile, back in Alcolu, George's younger sister, Amy Stinney, knew the truth about where her brother had been that afternoon. She later gave sworn testimony that she and George were together at the exact time the murders were believed to have occurred. The two of them were in their yard, behind the family's small home, tending to the cow near the fence when the girls passed by and spoke with them briefly. After that, George never left the yard. He had no opportunity to follow the girls, let alone commit such a violent act. Amy's memory of that moment was crystal clear, simple, consistent, and backed by the ordinary rhythm of the family's chores. But no one from law enforcement ever interviewed her. Her eyewitness account, which could have served as an airtight alibi for George, was never entered into the investigation. It wasn't dismissed for being unreliable, it was simply ignored. The arrest and interrogation of George Stinney Jr. was handled in secrecy, shielded from oversight and absent of any procedural protection. The officers claimed he confessed, but their version of the story came with no corroborating evidence. There were no blood-stained clothes, no fingerprints, no weapon tied to George, and no indication that he had ever left his yard at the time the girls disappeared. Instead, the public was told that a young boy had confessed to the crime, and that was all the authorities needed. To this day, legal historians and forensic psychologists point to this phase of the case as one of the clearest examples of coercion in American juvenile justice history. George, barely a teenager, likely had no concept of how serious the situation was. He had never been inside a courtroom, never spoken to a lawyer, and was completely unprepared to defend himself under such pressure. It's very possible he said whatever the officers wanted to hear, just to make it stop. But the damage had already been done. With no legal safeguards and no proper investigation, George's future had already been decided the moment he was taken from his home. What took place behind those jailhouse walls was never seen or heard by anyone who could speak on his behalf, and yet it would shape the rest of his life. This wasn't just a flawed interrogation, it was the beginning of a trial that had already made up its mind. Just 4 weeks after his arrest, on April 24, 1944, George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old boy barely tall enough to look over the courtroom rail, stood trial for the double murder of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames in the Clarendon County Courthouse in Manning, South Carolina. The entire trial lasted less than 1 working day, approximately 2 hours, and what unfolded inside that courtroom would later be described not as justice, but as an irreversible rush to judgment. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, but almost no one there was on George's side. He sat alone at the defense table, dressed in ill-fitting clothes, unable to speak to his parents or anyone familiar. His court-appointed attorney, Charles Plowden, was a local tax lawyer who had no criminal defense experience and who made little to no effort to build a case. He did not call a single witness, did not challenge the prosecution's evidence, and did not cross-examine the key officers who testified about George's alleged confession, a confession for which no signed statement, no transcript, and no recording existed. Plowden also failed to submit George's alibi, never mentioning that George's younger sister, Amy, had been with him the entire afternoon the girls went missing. The jury was composed of 12 white men, selected quickly from the local voter rolls, in a town still shaped by segregation and limited civic access for many families. The trial moved swiftly. The state presented its version of events through law enforcement officers who claimed George had confessed to the crime. But without a written statement and no physical evidence linking him to the scene, the case rested entirely on verbal testimony. There were no defense objections. No witnesses called for George. No attempt to bring forward character testimony or question inconsistencies in the timeline. The entire defense lasted mere minutes. George, quiet and likely too terrified to speak, was not called to testify on his own behalf. Once both sides had presented their cases, the jury retired to deliberate, and returned with a verdict in just 10 minutes. No transcript exists of their discussion, but their conclusion was immediate and unanimous. George Stinney Jr. was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge wasted no time. As was customary for a capital conviction under South Carolina law, George was sentenced to death by electrocution, to be carried out at the state penitentiary in Columbia. George was only 14 years, 6 months and 5 days old at the time of sentencing, making him the youngest person in 20th-century American history to be sentenced to death and executed. There was no appeal. No reconsideration. No motion for a retrial. The process was over before it truly began. Many who heard about the case later questioned not just the speed but the silence. George's family was kept at a distance, and black members of the Alcolu community were not welcomed inside the courthouse. The defense attorney never visited George again after the trial. And in the years to come, even some members of the victims' families would express doubts about how fairly the trial had been handled, asking whether the truth had been sacrificed in the rush to provide closure. This wasn't justice in any traditional sense. It was a sentence delivered with chilling speed, shaped by fear, pressure, and the absence of any meaningful defense. It was, as many have called it since, a legal lynching disguised in courtroom formalities, where the outcome was decided long before George Stinney Jr. ever stepped into the courtroom. Just 83 days after his arrest, on the morning of June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was led from his cell at the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia to a small room that housed the electric chair. He had spent the week since his trial in solitary confinement, locked away in a cell that barely held a cot and a toilet, in a prison filled with adult men more than twice his age. He was not allowed visitors. His family had no way to contact him. And for most of those 83 days, George sat in silence, alone, without support, awaiting the moment that had already been set in motion the day he was taken from his home. At just 14 years old, George was the youngest person in the United States to be executed in the 20th century. The chair, known simply as Old Sparky, was designed for fully grown men. As George was led into the execution chamber, witnesses would later recall how small and fragile he looked. Prison staff had to improvise, placing a Bible on the seat to elevate him enough so the headpiece could be strapped on correctly. At 7:30 a.m., George was strapped into the chair. Witnesses included members of the press, prison officials, and a few state representatives. His legs, arms, and chest were fastened with thick leather belts. The electrode cap was placed on his head. A wet sponge was tucked underneath to help conduct the electrical current. And as the black execution hood was pulled over his face, George reportedly muttered a final prayer. The switch was thrown. Thousands of volts surged through his body in just a matter of seconds. His small frame jolted under the current, and one of the straps slipped from his arm. His hand came loose, clenched into a fist, and then fell open. It took 2 jolts of electricity to end his life. The entire process lasted less than 4 minutes. When it was over, the doctor pronounced him dead. George's body was removed and no ceremony followed. His family, who had not been permitted to see him since his arrest, had to retrieve his remains in silence. He was buried in an unmarked grave at Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery in Pinewood, South Carolina. There were no headlines proclaiming outrage. No legal pushback. No petitions or public protests. In 1944, George's death was seen by many as a quick resolution to a terrible crime. But for those who knew him and for generations to come, that morning would stand as a haunting symbol of everything that had gone wrong. A child sentenced to death without evidence, without defense, and without time. Today, historians, legal scholars, and civil rights advocates refer to George's execution as one of the most tragic and preventable injustices in American legal history. Not just because of his age, but because of how little was done to protect him. In those final moments, George Stinney Jr. became not just the youngest person executed by the state, but a permanent reminder of how easily a justice system can fail when it forgets its responsibility to be fair. 4 decades after George Stinney Jr.'s execution on June 16, 1944, his story was buried beneath layers of silence. There was no official review of the trial, no reopening of the investigation, no legal efforts to challenge the conviction. His family quietly mourned their loss, carrying the weight of injustice in a state where few dared to speak against the outcome. George's grave, unmarked and mostly forgotten by the outside world, became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. A child lost not only to the electric chair, but to a justice system that moved too fast and asked too few questions. But George's story never truly disappeared. Over time, journalists, civil rights advocates, and historians began to revisit the case. They unearthed disturbing inconsistencies in the investigation, missing evidence, and unanswered questions that had long been left dormant. Why was there no physical evidence presented at trial? Why was the only witness for the defense, George's own sister, ignored? And how could a confession that was neither written nor signed become the sole basis for sending a 14-year-old boy to his death? In the early 2000s, George's surviving family members, including his sisters Amy and Catherine, began speaking publicly, refusing to let his memory be defined by the official record. They insisted that George was innocent, that he had never left the yard that day, and that the truth had been buried along with him. Their calls were finally answered in 2013, when a group of South Carolina defense attorneys, historians, and advocates filed a motion to have George's conviction vacated. They didn't just argue that George was innocent. They argued that he was denied a fair trial, that he had no legal representation, that his constitutional rights had been violated, and that his confession, if it ever existed, was coerced and unlawful. The request was heard in a courtroom nearly 70 years after George's execution. On January 21, 2014, a 2-day hearing was held at the same Clarendon County Courthouse where he had been sentenced to death decades earlier. This time the courtroom was different. Attorneys presented sworn affidavits, surviving family testimony, and powerful arguments showing that George's trial was flawed from the beginning. The courtroom listened not just to legal points, but to George's story. On December 17, 2014, Circuit Judge Carmen T. Mullen issued her decision. "I can think of no greater injustice than the violation of one's constitutional rights which has been proven to me in this case," she wrote. The execution of a child under these circumstances was, and still is, shocking to the conscience. George Stinney Jr.'s conviction was formally vacated. His name was legally cleared, and the state of South Carolina finally acknowledged what his family had known for generations, that justice had never been served. The ruling did not bring George back. It didn't undo the trauma inflicted on his family or the years of grief and stigma they endured. But it did restore his dignity. It made the world stop and look at how far the justice system had fallen in 1944, and how long it had taken to admit it. Today, George's story is taught in classrooms, examined in legal studies, and told in documentaries like this one, not simply to remember a child who was wrongfully executed, but to warn future generations of what happens when due process is ignored, when fear replaces fairness, and when the voice of the accused is silenced before it's ever heard. George Stinney Jr. was more than the youngest person ever executed in modern American history. He was a child, a son, a brother, and a name that should never have been forgotten. If this story moved you, if it made you think, question, or feel even a small part of the heartbreak carried by his family for generations, then help ensure stories like George's are never forgotten again. Please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel to support more powerful true crime documentaries that uncover overlooked stories, challenge our understanding of justice, and give voice to those who were silenced too soon. Leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe justice was truly served? What lessons should today's system take from what happened in 1944? Your voice matters in keeping this conversation alive.